some time on a couple of sections that have some really good, useful lessons for us today. So from a big picture summary standpoint, Saul has been killed, and David, prior to Saul's death, was anointed as king. He just wasn't acting king. It took a little while for all of that to work out. And so in chapter 1, one of the things that's striking to me is how David mourns for Saul and Jonathan. In 2 Samuel chapter 1, David really is sad about Saul's death. Why is that maybe an odd thing?
Because Saul tried to kill him a couple of
Yeah.
times. I don't have warm, fuzzy feelings toward those who tried to kill me. So.
Yeah, I think a couple of times if someone hurled a spear at me would get my attention, then it might change my attitude a little bit. I don't know, but David's perspective on it is so critical. What is the main thing that's driving David regarding Saul? What is the main thing? Saul is God's anointed. You said it the way the text speaks of it. You said it the way David said it. Saul was God's anointed. Now, that meant even when Saul was going in the wrong direction, David honored him not because he was going the wrong direction, but because he was God's anointed. And so David had opportunities to be rid of Saul. Yes? David could have mounted a pretty good resistance regarding Saul. David even could have won the people over and dethroned Saul altogether. He could have done that. He did not do that because Saul was operating in the capacity of God's anointed. Even though David was also God's anointed. It is impressive to me how he maintained his perspective and did not make it personal, even though the whole mess was extremely personal. To Joey's point, when someone's trying to kill you, it doesn't matter what they say. That's personal. And David did not get wrapped up in that. He maintained perspective. And so we see in chapter 1 that the perspective was sincere and genuine. We see him beginning in verse 17, his chant and his lament over Saul and Jonathan. He's just sad about the whole thing. He's sad about the way it happened, and he's sad about what happened to Saul, and he's certainly sad about what happened to Jonathan. And he wants everybody to know it and everybody to sing it or say it. Look at verse 18. Look at verse 18 of chapter 1. And he told them to teach the sons of Judah the song of the bow. He wanted them to sing it themselves. He wanted the people to be sad about what happened to Saul. And that perspective is helpful to us as we go through life and the things of life. It's also helpful for us just to back up a minute and realize that God knows what's happening. Is it so that God approved of Saul's behavior at every point? Do you think God approved of Saul's behavior? No. No. God knew what was going on. He understood that. And he was working out his plan, and David had the patience and the respect of God to work through that. And that's always been interesting to me, and almost, it's one of those things that's almost beyond us in our normal way of thinking, in our normal way of living, in the society in which we live. It's almost beyond us for someone to be so out of bounds and yet in a position where we still are honoring the position and patient with them because God knows and God will work it out. One of the first things that pops into my mind that everybody in the audience has to deal with on this subject is the political system and who our president may be. Now, I am not saying that our president is God's anointed from the standpoint of Saul being God's anointed, but I'll ask you this: is God involved in the kingdoms of men? Do we trust him to be involved in that and to handle that? And does that cause us to have respect even when the behavior, the activity, or the policy isn't what it ought to be? Does it? Does that cause us to have respect? It should. It should. I struggle with that sometimes. Somehow I get to thinking that I have all the answers and everybody else, they're just wrong. David has a great perspective on it. And so there's some lessons we can learn from that. Any comment about that before we just move right on? The second big thing I want to point out is that Abner makes Ishbosheth the king of Israel. Now this is where we get into Judah and Israel. You'll see this in great detail later on, but this is the first little bit of a divided kind of a kingdom, really, when it's formally divided. And so Abner was Saul's commander, and Abner takes Ishbosheth and makes him the king of Israel. He installs him, if you will. He just kind of promotes him. Is that according to God's plan? Is there anything in there that says this is God's plan? Who is to replace Saul from heaven's point of view? So far as we know, King David. Yeah, and so, but Abner does this. You can read about that in verse 8 of chapter 2. But Abner, son of Ner, commander of Saul's army, had taken Ishbosheth, son of Saul, and brought him and made him king over Gilead, over the Asherites, over Jezreel, over Ephraim, over Benjamin, and even over all Israel. He was 40 years old when he became king of Israel. He was king for 2 years. So these things are going on. Now, what I find interesting about this is all of this process is going to evolve over a period of 7 years, really. It's going to take a long time for David to be the monarch, the king over all of it. It's going to take a long time. So as this is working itself out, everybody is affected by it. Everybody in Judah, everybody in all Israel, everybody's affected by this. We don't have what we thought we were going to have. We all wanted a king. We ended up with Saul. That has fallen apart, and now we're just in this big mess. And so your average citizen, be they in Judah or Israel, is having to deal with various allegiances and work all of this out. The reason I think that's important is because we need to understand that whatever it is we're dealing with in the political world today, in our society, whether it's local government or anything else, it's not unique. This sort of thing's been going on a long time. And from heaven's point of view, God knows what's going to happen. He knows what He intends to happen, but it's going to take some time. And what happens shortly after Ishbosheth becomes king is what we would have thought impossible: civil war. We're going to fight one another. And you would think that there's no way that would ever transpire because God established Saul and then God anointed David, and so we have this perfect line of succession. All this is going to work out fine. It doesn't work out fine. And so we have great difficulty there. The next thing is, though, in response to all of that, David continues to increase in strength and in influence. Verse 1 of chapter 3. Now there was a long war, which is in the last part of chapter 2, between the house of Saul and the house of David. And David grew steadily stronger, but the house of Saul grew weaker continually. And that, of course, is God's intention. That's what God is planning, but it takes time for that to work out. My reaction to that always is, why is that taking time? I tend to think like this: if it's what God wants to happen, why don't we just make it happen? I mean, why the time? Why require the patience? And I don't have a complete answer to that, but what pops into my head about that is the trip from Egypt to the Promised Land. Could God have just made the people wake up in the Promised Land? Did He have the ability to just place them there? Wouldn't that have been awesome if that many people, however many it was, just all of a sudden showed up in the Promised Land? That'd be great. But that's not what God did. What God did was He said, you're going to have to learn. You're going to have to come to know Me and trust Me. You're going to have to be reacquainted with Me. So these folks are kind of in a, not the same, but a similar circumstance where all of this turmoil is going on. And David is getting stronger. Saul's house is getting weaker. His descendants are losing power and influence. His commander's losing power and influence. But the people, as always, are caught in the middle, and it takes time. Some really good advice I got a long time ago, like 30 years ago or more, in a little cafe in Tulsa. I don't know if it's still there. I haven't been back to that part of Tulsa in a long time, but it was called Frank's. And they serve these big cinnamon rolls. Anybody ever been there? Oh, y'all got to live a little more. Come on. The advice was this: learn to be patient. Just learn to be patient. Now, that was said really easily, and understood really easily. And some 30 or more years later, I'm still struggling with the concept of learn to be patient. Because oftentimes I see a simple solution that should be implemented tomorrow and we fix everything. What I fail to realize is my simple solution couldn't well be put in place tomorrow, and even if it were, it's not going to solve everything. Some things just take time. They just do. And God allows for that here, and David has to deal with that here. And it's remarkable how things develop. So David becomes stronger, and then Abner goes to David and says, wait a minute, let's join forces. And as that is working itself out, Joab, who is whom? Who is Joab? And David's primary military commander, Joab kills Abner. Joab doesn't like Abner because Abner killed one of Joab's relatives, his brother. And so there's that going on. So Abner and David working out a peace accord. Abner goes off for a while, comes back, Joab murders him. That's what he does. David is so upset about that. You think fragile peace, things might fall apart. It pushes David to reach out even more. And David kind of tells it like it is. He says, I didn't do that. That was not me. That is not what I wanted to have happen. That's just simply what took place. So after that happens, then Ishbosheth is murdered. You can read about that in chapter 4 and verse 7. They came in and got him as he was lying on his bed. Not a nice thing to do. By the way, how did David react to that? Did he have that's terrible, but don't worry about it attitude? No. What's interesting to me also is David saw and recognized Ishbosheth as the king of Israel, even though he was not a legitimate king of Israel, and wanted him treated respectfully because he was the son of Saul, because of his connection to it all. David wanted him to be treated respectfully.
I think we find through history that kings are against regicide.
Pretty much so. Yeah. We don't want that. So Ishbosheth is murdered. David kills the folks who did that. He deals with that. And then that kind of takes us down to David becoming king over all Israel. And it says in verse 1 of chapter 5, then all the tribes of Israel came to David at Hebron and said, behold, we are your bone and your flesh. Previously, when Saul was king over us, you were the one who led Israel out and in. And that is a reference to David could have taken advantage of that loyalty and that admiration while Saul was alive. He could have rebelled against Saul. He had the following, if you will. He just chose respectfully not to do that. And so the remarkable part of it is his heart toward other people, his heart toward what God had said and done, what God intended, and his patience in allowing God to work things out on God's time. So that's kind of the little summary I wanted to get through chapter 5. Anything about any of that you want to comment on, and feel free. Immediately, the war with the Philistines picks up. David and Israel, Judah and Israel combined, are successful. God is with them. David's kingdom is growing. This is all the good news about David. We'll let Brother Berkeley get into some of the negative stuff beginning next week. This is all good about David. David is strong. He's making good decisions. He is supporting the people around him who are doing the same kind of thing, and he is honoring God, and God is responding to him. Except there is one little thing that happens in chapter 6, and we'll get into that now. By the way, before we go to chapter 6, look at verse 12 of chapter 5. Verse 12 of chapter 5, it says, and David realized that the Lord had established him as king over Israel, and that he had exalted his kingdom for the sake of his people Israel. I love the way the New American Standard reads. David realized. Anybody's read differently? David knew, perceived. Yeah. Isn't it wonderful when we get it, when it clicks with us, when we see the blessings of God, when we see what God has provided for us, when it means something to us and changes our behavior and our attitude. That seems to be where David is. He realized it. He got it. He perceived it. He knew it. And he acknowledged that God was doing this, not David himself. Yes, sir?
David was a man after God's own heart.
That's a fact. And that is the kind of thing that really, well, that stands out the whole way. Even when persecuted, he can be very, very vengeful from time to time, but from a just standpoint. So very good, very good, very good point. Okay, so that's it through chapter 5. That takes us to chapter 6, and when we get into chapter 6, we talk about Uzzah. Now, the story of Uzzah is kind of one of those that you learn about when you're probably too young to really learn about Uzzah, and at least I did in Bible class. It was shocking for me when I, went through the Uzzah story and God striking someone dead. For what? He touched something, right? He touched something. I remember talking to Mom and Dad about that when I was a little fella. He touched it. Struck him dead. He touched it. There's a reference we'll go to in 1 Chronicles that will be helpful at the end of the Uzzah story for us. So it says in verse 3, they placed the ark of God on a new cart that they might bring it from the house of Abinadab, which was on a hill, and Uzzah and his brother were leading the new cart. And you know how this story goes. Everybody was celebrating. Everybody was happy. It's a wonderful thing. We're returning the ark, taking it to where David wants it to be. But we come to the threshing floor there, and it looks like things are going to go sideways. And so Uzzah reaches out toward the ark. He touches the ark, and God strikes him down. Verse 7. So a little backstory for us. In Numbers chapter 4, we learned that the Kohathites were to carry the ark. It was their specific responsibility. Now, they were a part of what larger group? The Levites. They're part of the Levites, but their specific work was the utensils and the things in the tent primarily. That was their task. Some of them kind of rebelled about that and wanted a bigger job, but nonetheless, that was their role. They were to carry those items. And in Numbers chapter 7, verses 1 through 9, you have them discussing the pack-up procedure. And the pack-up to move procedure was all of these things are going to be taken down, they're going to be folded up, they're going to be placed where they're supposed to be, and then they're going to be carried on the shoulders of the sons of Kohath. That's how we're going to do it. They're going to be carried on their shoulders. God was specific about that. And then in verse 3 of chapter 6, they put the ark on a new cart. Uzzah took hold of it or touched it, depending on which version you're reading, and then God struck him down for irreverence. That is the New American Standard word, irreverence, in verse 7. Does anyone have a different word? God struck him down there for his irreverence. Give me a different word. Because of his error. Anything else? Okay. Verse 7 begins with the anger of the Lord burned against Uzzah. I don't know how many times I've heard someone say, and I have probably said, from Uzzah's point of view, he was doing what? He was doing in that moment what he thought was the right thing to do. I have heard folks try to make an argument that it was an impulsive kind of a thing, and therefore, calling into question God's judgment. We're not doing that. Make no mistake, we're not doing that. What we do want to do is reconcile what happened with what we can understand about what Uzzah was doing and about what God had said and expects. And so, the idea of you've made a critical error is expressed in verse 7. Now, the ark of God is a special thing, yes? It is not a common thing, it is a special thing. And when God specifies something, makes something special, makes something specific, then that has specific rules that go along with it. God's always been that way. When He tells us to do something specific, then those are the things He wants us to do, and we have to live with that. So this is what took place here with Uzzah and the ark. Now, go with me over to 1 Chronicles in chapter 15. Let's look at it not from a different perspective, but a slightly different angle. 1 Chronicles in chapter 15. Remember now, in 1 Chronicles, you have a retelling of some of the very same things we're looking at in 2 Samuel. And so it's helpful sometimes to go over there and get that perspective. Okay, we're not going to read it all, but look at verse 1 of 1 Chronicles 15. Verse 1, now David built houses for himself in the city of David, and he prepared a place for the ark of God and pitched a tent for it. Then David said, look at verse 2, no one is to carry the ark of God but the Levites. For the Lord chose them to carry the ark of God and to minister to him forever. So, David starts out with, we're going to do this the right way. God has some rules. We are aware of those rules. We are going to abide by those rules. Verse 11, he calls for the priests, the Levites, and he says, verse 12, you are the heads of the fathers' households of the Levites. Consecrate both yourselves and your relatives, that you may bring up the ark of the Lord God to Israel, to the place I have prepared for it. Now look at verse 13. Because you did not carry it at first, the Lord God made an outburst on us, for we did not seek him according to the ordinance. That's one of those marvelous little statements that really serves to simplify life for you and me today. We talk sometimes about principles that extend beyond their context. They are everywhere in the text and everywhere in life. There are principles that extend beyond their context. This is one of those principles that extends beyond its context. Contextually, David is saying, okay, the first time we tried this, it was a mess. Uzzah died, it was a mess. And the reason it was a mess is because we did not seek God according to the ordinance. We did not do it the way God had prescribed it be done. And so what he's saying is, now we're going to do it according to the ordinance. One of the things that really troubles me from time to time, that is just challenging for me, is when people talk about the concept of legalism today. What is the general definition of legalism today? Give me some kind of help with that. By the law? Okay, so what do folks mean today when they say, well, you're just being legalistic? What does that mean? Because rarely is it said today in a positive fashion. I don't believe it's a compliment most of the time. What is meant by that? Okay, you're putting rules in front of heart, service, and so on.
Because the goal here was to get the ark from point A to point B. Okay, we carried on the poles, or we put it on the car. Let's go get from point A to point B.
What's the big deal?
That's legalism. That's how opponents of law.
So let me ask you this, just so we get it out there. Are we saved by the keeping of law? Is anybody in here going to go to heaven because they have kept God's law perfectly? No. No, not at all. None of us. We're going to go to heaven, if we're there at all, by the grace of God. Every one of us will be there, if we're there at all, by the grace of God. I believe because of His grace and because of His promises, we will be there. I am confident we will be there by His grace, not because we're so good at doing what He says. Does that principle then mean I don't have to pay attention to what He says and I don't have to be careful about what He says? Does grace remove the obligation to obey? If we ever were to get confused about that, we could go straight into Romans chapter 6 and just settle in there for a while, right? Because Romans 6 actually literally begins with the question, does obedience matter because we're saved by grace? It begins with that question. Paul phrases it like this: shall we continue in sin that grace may abound? If God's grace is as good as He says it is, and it is, if God's grace is as good as the argument Paul makes about it, and it is, if God's grace is so good, then why would we even worry about sin to begin with? Let God's grace handle it. The more God's grace is expended, the more glorious God appears to be. It would seem from that perspective that it would almost be our obligation to just sin like crazy so grace can just be so prevalent and so marvelous. And Paul says, don't ever think like that. Don't ever think like that. How shall we who died to sin live any longer in it? There is a commitment that we made when we became Christians, and that is to follow Christ. The commitment that we made, that Paul's getting to in Romans 6:2, is we said we're going to be Christians, and so we can't do whatever we want to do. We can't say, well, surely God wouldn't mind. Well, it seems to me that. We can't do that. And back to this verse, we have to seek Him according to the ordinance. We have to do it the way He said to do it to the best of our ability. We're still going to make mistakes. I think it is fair to say that. We're not going to be perfect all the time. But the fact that we're not perfect all the time has nothing to do with the obligation to strive to be perfect. It doesn't. You are to be perfect because He is perfect. The striving is the thing. And we have to get that in our heads instead of just washing our hands with the matter of obedience, or picking and choosing the things about which we want to be obedient and disregarding the other things that we do not want to be obedient about based on the concept of legalism. If I were to ask you if God's a legalist, what would you say? If God Himself is a legalist, what would you say? That is a trick question, by the way. What would you say? Let me ask you another question before you answer the question, is God a legalist? Has God ever broken His law? No. Does God believe in His laws? Are they valuable to Him? Do they serve an important role in all of this to Him? Yeah. He made them. David here in 1 Chronicles chapter 15 and verse 13 says, the reason God made an outburst on us is not because Uzzah was a really nice guy trying to help. The reason God made an outburst is because we did not seek Him according to the ordinance. That is a powerful statement. We might back up and say, wait a minute, what does he mean, seek Him? What does that mean? Anybody's read differently there? Does anybody have a different word there? Verse 13. How were they seeking God? I want you to tell me, what were they doing that could be characterized as seeking God? 1 Chronicles 15:13. Do what? Okay, what were they in the process of doing, though? They were trying to move the ark. They were trying to take the ark where the ark ought to be from their perspective. They were trying to deal appropriately with God's ark. But they did not do it according to God's specifics. David is acknowledging that here and saying, now this time we're going to do it God's way. Last time we didn't do it God's way and there was an outburst, God destroyed. So we're not going to do it our way. We're going to do it His way this time. Yes, sir. Guidance? Okay, I like that. Yeah. So do we understand now how simple a concept that is? I'm not asking if it's simple to do everything God has told us to do. I'm asking, do we get the simplicity of the concept of what David is saying? When we go after God, when we seek God, when we want to be pleasing to God, when we're trying to be what we ought to be, Christians, we have to do it according to God's guidance, according to God's ordinance, according to God's rules. That has to be our desire and our motive. If we fail in that process, but we are striving in that direction and we seek to make things right, that's where God's grace is present and effective and helpful. Again, Romans 6. But I find it so interesting that the Apostle Paul devotes so much time in his letter to the Romans to the subject of we died to sin, so we cannot live any longer in it, and we are a slave to that whichever we obey, either righteousness or sinfulness, and we have to make the right choice. That, ladies and gentlemen, is not legalism. That's just how God deals with His people. That's just what God expects of us. And so instead of us trying to put a label on that, we should just simply take David's position and say, we're going to seek God according to His ordinances, according to His guidance. We're going to try to do what God told us to do the best way we possibly can. And that's our humility, our humble heart. We're going to seek Him as best we can. It is, I don't mind telling you, quite an arrogant thing for me to say, I understand what God said, but. It doesn't make any sense for me to do that.
I think David just got overzealous and wanted to replace the ark.
Yeah. We didn't want to take the time, didn't want to go through the process, whatever it was. It's not that David set out to be evil. It's not that Uzzah was trying to do a bad thing. I can get on board with Uzzah was trying to do a good thing. I have no problem with that. He thought it was going to fall. He reached out to touch it. I get that. But this stands for all time as one of those moments where when God says it, God means it, and I have to be okay with that, not fighting against that, resisting that, and struggling about that. David's statement here in 1 Chronicles makes it clear we have to seek him according to his ordinances. Yes, sir.
Paul says the same thing in Titus 2, beginning in verse 11, going to the end of the chapter.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Matthew 7, beginning of verse 21, does pretty well hammer that point home as well. And thank you for that. Both of those references tell us that the principle extends beyond the page here in 1 Chronicles. And the reason that's such a big thing is because all of us, every one of us, are susceptible to marginalization of God's Word. Small, little bitty, seemingly insignificant changes to accommodate us and what we want, to make us more comfortable, to make our feelings more legitimate, that end up eroding God's ordinances. It's not that this person or that person has that potential problem. We all do. And so I think it is good for us, even though we had a lot to talk about in chapter 7 of 2 Samuel, it is good for us to settle in on the concept of we have to be content with God's ordinances and God's laws. Matthew 7, beginning in verse 21, not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but he who does the will of my Father who is in heaven will enter. That is 1 Chronicles 15:13. He who does the will of my Father who is in heaven will enter. I can't apologize for that, and I can't marginalize that, and I cannot erase bits and pieces of that to make me feel better. And honestly, I'm just not interested in it. The challenge is there for us to do what he says. Let's gang up together and try to do what he says. And let's support one another as we try to do what he says. And let's just give it our all together, trying to do what God has told us to do. So, chapter 7, I know time has expired, it tells me back there, but chapter 7, here's some lessons for you about the house of David. We won't get into that. We'll save that maybe for something else at some point. Thank you so much for participating along with us.